while you allow crime in your streets and you send your henchmen down here to commit assault against people by making loud noises, assault against police officers who are doing their job.
They're terrified of the voters. They're terrified of people having a voice, and that's why they're trying to put a gag order on President Donald John Trump. Have you heard that, a gag order? Well, you know what I say to Alvin Bragg and his gag order? Boo! Boo! And you know something? To Fishborough, to Gavin Wax, to all the New Yorkers and the free Americans who stand here with me today, they can gag Donald Trump, but they can't gag all of us, and they will not gag all of us. Our voices will be heard, and we will not stop.
I just want the law to be applied equally, and if you're going to go after people on these pretty trivial things, then do it equally. But if you're only going to do it on trivial things on one side, then yeah, I think that's ridiculous. And if there's a crime committed, then absolutely. I mean, we've seen the news of Hunter Biden. He's on photos committing crimes, whether it's narcotics or with prostitutes or whatever it is. No one's going after that. And you can understand that as this continues to happen, respect for the justice system, respect for our institutions, faith in the rule of law is going to continue to deteriorate. So it's a problem for society as a whole.
We are live. Thanks for joining us back on Firebrand. We are broadcasting from room 2021 of the Rayburn House Office Building on the Capitol Complex in Washington, D.C., and that was New York Young Republican Club President Gavin Wax, who will join us in just a moment to give the granular view of what was happening in Manhattan on the ground, how this is being perceived, and who are some of these political players that have gone from features of New York governance to now international villains, I would say, in the case of Alvin Bragg. I also want to let you know, in the final segment of the show today, we are going to be showing a film created by the Heritage Foundation called The 20, and it's about 10 minutes long. I'm going to show it to you at the end of the show because it really walks through the vision of people like Chip Roy and Eli Crane, Anna Paulina Luna, Andy Biggs, and myself as we were fighting to change the House of Representatives. So I want to give you an inside look, and they did this great documentary that brings you in the room to see exactly what we were fighting for and why the tactics we used were effective in that regard. So joining me now to talk about everything going on in Manhattan, president of the New York Young Republican Club, Gavin Wax. And I say frequently, the New York Young Republican Club is the premier activism organization within young Republican politics, really, if you look at Republican politics broadly, because it's not about coming together for conferences. It's not a think tank. It is activism. It is getting out there and getting the message through, sometimes in a very contested environment in New York. So, Gavin, I want to get into all the Trump stuff, having MTG there, having Jack Posobiec on the ground. But first, just as president of your organization, what has made the New York Young Republican Club so different in terms of its attractiveness to people who really see politics as an enterprise of activity, not just an enterprise of thinking?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for having me and all the kind words. And I think you make a great point there that this institution is about action. It's about getting out there. It's about knocking on doors. It's about organizing rallies. It's about engaging potential voters, growing the party, and fighting even deep behind enemy lines in a place like New York City to achieve some serious political ends, which we have started to see in many local races that we have been involved in. But we were not content to continue the long-standing Republican tradition of cocktail parties and just talking a big game, but not actually getting out there and fighting the battles that need to be waged. We are willing to roll our sleeves up, get into the streets, go into Lower Manhattan, and protest and let our voices be heard for our conservative beliefs and principles. So we see many other organizations that would much rather stay on the sidelines and snark and make snide remarks and say the end is near and be nihilistic and defeatist. But we're looking forward to continue to fight to take this country back one block at a time, even behind enemy lines in the belly of the beast, New York City.
We are not going to tweet our way to victory against the left. It is going to require showing up and then bringing people into our movement with activities, ideas, and with a sense of focus and drive that I certainly see in the New York Young Republican Club. So take me to the decision you guys made to reach out to NYPD to get a secure space for those who support President Trump, to have their voices heard in New York, and then obviously great to see MTG, Posobiec, and others there with you. But what about being there was important for your organization?
Absolutely. So 2 weeks ago, we had our kind of our beta launch of this rally. This was before the indictment was official, but it was just leaked, and President Trump called for protests. We were the first organization to answer that call, and we did it right here in Manhattan outside the courthouse. We did Collect Pond, which has a long history of being a swamp, and then later the center of the 5 Points, which was originally New York's red light district. So it's always been a center of corruption and swampiness, and it continues to this day. But we chose that spot. We did a smaller protest that was confined. We vetted everyone. And why did we do that? Because the narrative, not just on the left, but also on the right, was that Republicans and conservatives can no longer protest. They can no longer rally. They can no longer exercise their First Amendment rights. And we absolutely wanted to dispute that argument and show that even in New York City, Republicans, conservatives, MAGA supporters can and should come out and exercise their First Amendment rights. Because the second we give up on that, the second we stay home, the left has already won another major victory. So we had that protest 2 weeks ago, had a lot of press, we got some headlines, but then this time was different. This was the big one with Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you mentioned. After the news of the indictment dropped, we had several days to promote it. And this entire park that we occupied is a full city block. And you can see from some of the photos that you're showing, we had this block, this park, filled corner to corner, edge to edge, entrance to entrance with Trump supporters. It was a beautiful sight to behold. You could see them as far out as the eye could see. It was a sea of people. And of course, there was a lot of press. There was international press, domestic press. But it was important that we let our voices be heard in a peaceful way to show the media, to show the leftist establishment in New York City that we are not the deplorables that they paint us to be, that we are actually the civil side. We are the side that can, speak to the issues, and it's the other side, the side that has to blow whistles and bang drums and screech hysterical things that has no idea what they're talking about. So it was an honor to host the Congresswoman down here in New York, or up here in New York rather, for her, and let the entire New York City political establishment know that there is a strong base of support in New York City for their hometown hero, President Donald J. Trump.
You certainly got the attention of New York City Mayor Eric Adams, who took note of your upcoming event, made mention of it. And I spoke with Marjorie Taylor Greene yesterday, and she was concerned that the reason Eric Adams put that statement out was to try to gaslight violence against those of you who had no intention of harming anyone or engaging in anything other than First Amendment protected activity. Do you think Mayor Adams called you out in hopes that people would have come there to do you harm?
Absolutely. I think this was all part of a narrative formation scheme by the mayor and his lackeys to try to paint the Congresswoman in a certain light, try to paint the club in a certain light, and obviously try to paint Trump and his supporters in a certain light. They were basically projecting what they wished to happen. And in fact, I have friends on the city council and in city government who let me know before our last protest that they had an all hands on deck meeting with every elected official in the city, from the city council all up to Congress, the mayor, all the commissioners, everyone, and they were basically describing the event as the next January 6th. They were talking about snipers on roofs, all these sorts of things. So they were definitely trying to put things out into the ecosystem to sort of cajole a certain response from their left-wing compatriots. And to that end, they did have some success. The biggest hecklers of the Congresswoman and of our rally were actually elected officials. You had a colleague of yours, Jamal Bowman, who was yelling at the Congresswoman, telling telling her to go back to her own district, when I don't think the congressman knows exactly where he is, because he wasn't in his own district either in Lower Manhattan. And then, of course, you had perpetual activist Jumaane Williams, who's the public advocate of the city of New York. And then you had a local city council person, I'm going to say person because I'm not sure this individual's gender, Chi Osei, who was handing out whistles. Of course, they can't hear our arguments. They can't hear our side. They just want to drown us out. But despite that, we outnumbered them 10-1. And when the press was there and they were trying to ask, well, was this a good showing? I would say absolutely. Having 1,000 people in a park is a great showing, and outnumbering the local leftists 10-1 in a borough that votes 85-90% Democrat is a great turnout for Republicans and conservatives. So again, to the rest of the country, to the rest of the conservative nation, if we could do it here in New York, you could do it wherever you are.
And when you look at the body politic and the shape of various political groups, I think there's an awakening now on the right that I saw reflected in who you were able to draw to your event. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Alvin Bragg. Alvin Bragg has stitched together an indictment that is legal foolishness. It's legal voodoo. You would never bootstrap these misdemeanors to a federal election matter in order to try to cascade some 34 felonies on a single agreement to settle a private dispute. But help me understand this guy as a political figure, as a New Yorker. You understand the politics there. How did Alvin Bragg go from being the editor of the Civil Rights Journal at Harvard Law Review to having this major role as the Manhattan DA?
It's a great question. Alvin Bragg is the product of all the American institutions that we once held in high regard. Harvard Law. This is a gentleman with his pedigree. You would expect a completely different person, someone who could actually articulate his point of view rather than just reading off a piece of paper at a press conference. He represents the nihilistic globalist worldview of the American elite, particularly of the New York elite. He has no idea what he's doing.
Is he smart? Is he smart, because you leave that press conference he did the other day wondering if this is a highly capable individual, or is he one of these machine candidates? I know the way politics works on the left in Manhattan. You don't just show up on the scene and get somewhere. You've got to be part of this vertically integrated system they have. Does he come out of that? Certainly not an outsider.
Oh, no, absolutely. You raise a good point. The election of DAs and judges and most offices in New York is not determined in the general election. We are a one-party town, but it is determined through the Democrat machine political process, which doesn't even start at the primary. It starts well before the primary in back rooms. It starts through a feeder system that goes all the way down to the county committee, the district leader spots. And he is a product of that system, and so is Mayor Adams. Mayor Adams is a product of the Brooklyn Democrat machine. So he was elected overwhelmingly. Our club endorsed and supported a member of our club, Thomas Kniff, against him, and we handed out literature. We campaigned the old school way here in New York, but this is a post-political borough in many ways. So our valiant efforts and the valiant efforts of Alvin Bragg's challenger in that race were largely fruitless. But at the end of the day, he is simply an extension of the popular will of Manhattan, which is largely this nihilistic worldview that puts the criminal above the victim. And he has made a name for himself as district attorney in his refusal to prosecute a whole wide range of violent offenses, from assaults to burglaries to even rapes against people with long rap sheets. And he seems to hold victims in a particular with a particular type of disdain, particularly victims that had the audacity to defend themselves, such as Jose Alba, where it took him close to a month to drop charges. He was a bodega worker, as you may recall, who was nearly stabbed to death and was able to fight off his attacker. And just this past week, during this entire media circus around the Trump indictment, there was a garage attendant here in Manhattan who miraculously also survived an attempted murder when he was able to steal the gun of the perpetrator and use it against him and kill that perpetrator. And what happened to this gentleman? Well, of course, he was charged and he was held in handcuffs, and it was only due to public pressure and the media circus that was already in town that led Alvin Bragg to drop the charges ultimately. So this is a guy with a totally warped view of crime, of law and order.
But it's
and
a virtue
society as a
signal,
whole.
right? I mean, and if you're virtue signaling like Alvin Bragg's doing, the only reason you would put your own constituents, the people who elected you, at risk for the sake of these woke policies is because you believe that that's going to ingratiate yourself to the elite in some way, and that will create upward political mobility. And so, in a way, the incentive structure you're describing, Gavin, would suggest that Alvin Bragg can even win for losing. If a court were to dispose of this matter, either directly or on appeal through a motion to dismiss, by saying that as a matter of law, you cannot lash these things together like disparate parts of a Mr. Potato Head doll to evade a statute of limitations, regardless of what the facts are. If a court were to say that, Alvin Bragg would be able to lean into the incentive structure you just described, saying, well, I went after Trump. I did all I could. I was there dragging him before a court to be arraigned and be forced back into our jurisdiction. Is this a guy running for something else? Because you almost look at it and say, Alvin Bragg was a nobody 20 minutes ago, and now he's this internationally known name because he's taken this action against our country, against a lot of the constitutional principles that we've held dear through the Republican and Democrat administration. So what do you think the long game is for this guy?
Oh, absolutely. I think he's getting fast-tracked to some sort of position, maybe at the state level, maybe even federally. I mean, he's going to be the darling of the elite leftist circles in this country. I mean, he is answering to them because he represents a constituency that is post-political. He's not answering to the whims of his constituents who are largely, apathetic and apolitical and are not really involved. He's answering to his donors. He's answering to the political machine leaders that put him there to begin with. So you make a solid point there that that's his incentive structure. That's his incentive structure for completely embarrassing himself by even just completely bipartisan standards, just with the merits of this indictment in this case. I mean, he's citing Penal Code, I think 17510, which is a Class E felony, which basically states that the fraud needs to be in furtherance of another crime, of an underlying crime, but he never cites what that crime is. I mean, this entire copy and pasted indictment is a complete joke, and it's a complete slap in the face to the American judicial system. But he operates with impunity because he knows he can operate with impunity. And a part of me respects the lefts and the elites just shamelessness and their and how blunt and blatant they are in their corruption and their politicization of our institutions. I mean, you have to almost admire it from a power politics perspective that they're so just cavalier in terms of how they go about their political warfare. And I only wish we had Republican leaders, more Republican leaders such as yourself and Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who could counter that kind of mentality and that kind of chutzpah in New York speak with an equal vigor to push back against these injustices and this obscene abuse of power.
It's clear Trump sees it as you do, part of a series, part of a broader plan. I took note that in his remarks last night in Mar-a-Lago, President Trump didn't localize his critique to Alvin Bragg. He talked about how there is this interwoven effort with a Fulton County prosecutor, with Jack Smith, to get Trump at any cost and by any means. You, in your role as president of the New York Young Republican Club, also talked to a number of right and center-right leaders around the world. And political groups, young people make their way through New York a lot. I've been at your club where you've had folks from Europe in, understanding our politics and sharing ideas about what's going on elsewhere. How do you think this plays globally? What is the global verdict on the United States crossing the Rubicon and indicting a former president on the flimsiest of charges?
I think it makes us look like a bigger joke than we have already demonstrated over the last few months, few years of the Biden administration. I think they look at it like the downfall of the United States. I mean, you have President Bukele in El Salvador coming out and boldly proclaiming that the United States is no longer in a position to lecture anyone on human rights, on civil rights, and all the rest. And I think it's actually doing a big disservice to the neoconservative talking point of being, this doer of of good on the world stage, on this, this nation that's simply working to advance these beautiful ideals of democracy and human rights and all that. I mean, we are just showing ourselves to be the emperor with no clothes on the world stage, that we don't practice what we preach. I mean, we are entering in to the ranks of such notable nations such as Uganda and Ukraine and Bolivia and Nicaragua, who have jailed their opposition leaders. This is something that simply doesn't happen in a first world civilized nation with respect for the rule of law and civil rights. This is the kind of action that a tin pot dictatorship takes. So I think it's an embarrassing step for our country, and I think people are viewing it as such, and they're viewing it as the continued decline of the American empire, of the American global hegemony, and it just goes to show that we are a declining empire, and the world is noticing, and we're rapidly entering into a state of a multipolar world order with the likes of China and Russia and India and whatever else rising up and replacing us economically, politically, militarily, and otherwise, and they're switching their currencies, they're switching how they do trade. I mean, we are a nation that refuses to accept where we're heading and where we are currently, and we're operating as if this is still, the end of the Cold War. We are, Pax Americana, but those days are long gone.
He knows the world. He knows New York. President of the New York Young Republican Club, at Gavin Wax. Follow him. And Gavin, where else are you publishing right now? You put out some pretty provocative prose now and again. Let folks know where they can follow you.
Well, thank you again for having me on, Congressman. And yes, you could follow me in my writing. I write for American Greatness, Town Hall, Newsmax, a few other conservative outlets. A piece recently I wrote, There is No Trumpism Without Trump, was shared by President Donald J. Trump. I was very honored by that. I also write occasionally in Newsweek about the great work that President Bukele is doing down in El Salvador, and the great work President Orban, Prime Minister Orban, is doing in Hungary, and where we can look to emulate conservative policies and leadership abroad and maybe bring it back home. I mean, that just goes to show, onto our last point, that we have to now look abroad in some respects to see leadership and success, because we have so little of it here at home.
Gavin Wax, always one of my favorite people to talk to about what's going on in politics and policy and global affairs. Thanks for joining us on Firebrand, my friend.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Thank you. So a lot